Hello everyone, and welcome to Mass Analytics Masterclasses, where we will try to uncover all the secrets and all the tips behind the creation of sound statistical and commercial models in order to empower our clients to better manage their marketing mix modeling project. So previously, we have covered the modeling part of the marketing mix modeling, where we try to understand better how we can run regression models, how we can better select models, and we have put an emphasis in explaining how genetic algorithms work in order to create sound and robust models. In today's course, we'll be covering contribution and ROI. We'll start by introducing the concept of contribution. Then we'll move into explaining the concept of reference points, which will lead us to introducing as well the concept of adjusted and aggregated contribution. And we will end with two concepts, the ROI, and the last part would be dedicated to the explanation of the relationship between contribution and ROI, which is one of the most important relationships that a modeler needs to be aware of when it comes to modeling. Looking at the marketing mix modeling workflow, we are at stage 4, which is the modeling stage. And part of the modeling stage is to actually not only create the model, but also compute contribution and ROI. Now, looking at the Software Master, the one-stop platform created by Mass Analytics that allows you to create your project end-to-end, there is a dedicated module that can help you measure ROI and contribution. And this is actually module number 4, which is a module that is dedicated to modeling. Contribution calculation. Let's look at some terminology. So what is contribution? Contribution is actually the impact that a specific variable will have on your KPI or your dependent variable. The reference point is actually a parameter that you would be subtracting from the contribution. Aggregated contribution is actually the summation of different contributions, and adjusted contribution is actually an aggregated contribution or a contribution from which you subtract the reference. Now, the base or the base sales is actually the level of sales that you would have achieved if there were no investment that you have done in any of your marketing activities. Don't worry, we'll be covering those concepts one by one in the subsequent slides. One of the reasons for which contribution is really key to any marketing mix modeling project is because it's the fundamental of one of the most popular charts in marketing mix modeling, which is actually the uplift chart, the contribution chart, or the layer chart. So in the chart that you can see in my screen, you can see different variations depicted by different colors, and actually these represent the contribution of each marketing and media activity. Your clients will be interested in looking at the size of those in order to determine how much every single factor has contributed to their sales or their KPI. So how do you compute contribution? As we mentioned earlier on, contribution is the sales impact or the incremental impact of a variable on your sales. So to compute that is as simple as taking the coefficient as estimated by your equation and you time it by the level of your activity. The product of these two entities will give you what you call contribution. For example, if I computed a coefficient for advertising and I have the level of advertising over the fitted period, then multiplying the level of advertising by the coefficient that has been estimated by the equation will give me the contribution of advertising. Now, if in my model I have different variables, for example, advertising, distribution, promotions, and obviously the base, in order to obtain the total contribution, I'll be adding up the contribution of the base, the contribution of advertising, the contribution of distribution, and the contribution of promotion, and that will give me the total contribution that you have seen earlier on in the chart that I have showed. The contribution chart breaks down the impact of each factor. When you are constructing your contribution chart, and when you are modeling a specific KPI, you would expect that some factors would have a positive impact and some others would have a negative impact. In the chart that you see in my screen, we have things like price, seasonality, competition contributing negatively to my sales. And on the other hand, I have things like online media, promotions, direct marketing, and offline media contributing positively to my sales. Now, stacking up all those bars and all those activities will make up my final model that you can see as a dotted line in this chart. Now, if I want to understand where can I find the contribution that I have explained in the previous slide, this brown bar is actually the contribution of offline on that specific week. How do we obtain it? It's simply by taking the estimated coefficient from your equation and you multiply it by the level of activity on offline on that week. The product of these two entities will make up the size of the brown bar that you can see on the screen. The reference point. As I explained earlier on, the reference point is a parameter that we remove from the contribution. When we remove the reference point from the contribution, we obtain what we call the adjusted contribution. Now we have four choices. We can either remove the max of the contribution, the minimum of the contribution, the initial state of the contribution, or nothing, which means zero. What I'll try to explain in the subsequent slides is when we should be removing the min, the max, the zero, and the initial point. Let's explore option 1. In this option, we won't be removing anything from the contribution of the price. In the chart, we have our sales movements and we have the contribution of the price. The chart looks bulky because actually, by not removing anything from the contribution of the price, we are representing the full impact of the price. However, in real life, your clients are not interested in the full movement of the price. What they are interested in is actually how much sales that they have gained as a result of an improvement in the position when it comes to pricing, and how much loss in sales they have recorded as a result of worsening in the price position. This graph with zero reference doesn't actually translate that. That's why we do not recommend in this specific context to use option 1, which is not removing anything from the contribution of the price. Now let's consider option 2, which is actually removing the minimum contribution. In the graph, you still have your sales movement and you have the contribution of the price after removing the minimum. Now, when the price is at its highest, that's where you don't gain any sales. Now, when the price decreases, you will see that actually you have gained some sales. But when the price increases again, that's where you see that you are losing sales. So actually, by removing the minimum contribution, you are capable of showing the movement in your sales as a result of the movement of your price. So minimum in the context of price is a viable option. Let's look at option 3. In option 3, we'll be removing the maximum of the contribution. In the graph, again, you see your sales movement and you see the contribution of your price post removing the maximum contribution. When the price is very high, you are losing a lot of sales. But when your price position improves, which means that your price decreases, you see that you are losing less and less sales. At the end, when our price is at its minimum, that's where we are not losing any more sales. And that's actually what removing the maximum contribution helps you understand and helps you chart. So in that context, we can say that removing the maximum contribution is a viable solution for this problem. Let's explore option 4. In this option, we will be removing the initial contribution from the contribution of the price. In the chart, you see your sales movement against the contribution of the price post removing the initial contribution. In the beginning, I am at the initial stage, and that's why we are not gaining or losing any sales because I am at my initial point. Now, each time that my price increases compared to the initial point, that translates in losing sales. However, when my price improves compared to my initial point, which means that it decreases compared to the initial price, we see that our contribution improves, and that translates in a gain of contribution. So again, to summarize, taking out the initial contribution from the contribution of the price is actually also a viable solution in this context. So which option should you use? If the price always increases, it's preferable to use the maximum as a reference point. If the price always decreases, it's advisable to use minimum as a reference point. When the price fluctuates, you could either use minimum, maximum, or initial point. That was the context of the example I took you through earlier on. Aggregated or grouped contribution. Aggregated contribution, as its name indicates, is actually summing up the contribution of many variables that have the same nature. For example, if I want to compute the contribution of online media and I have used search, display, and social media as variables, I would be just summing up the contribution of search, display, and social media. Now, if from that aggregate contribution I remove the reference point, whether it's initial or maximum or minimum or nothing, I will obtain what I call adjusted contribution. Return on investment or ROI. ROI or mROI. It's exactly the same thing, return on investment or marketing ROI. ROI is used to measure the efficiency of a specific media or marketing activity, and it could also be used in order to compare the efficiency between different media or marketing activities. So how do we compute ROI? It's simply the revenue or the incremental revenue that is generated by an activity and that is extracted from the model divided by the cost of the investment. For example, I'm modeling sales, and part of the variables that I have used in order to explain my sales is display advertising. Using my model, I can compute the contribution of display advertising. Remember, it's the coefficient as estimated by the equation times the level of display activity. Now, if I take that incremental impact in terms of revenue and then divide it by the cost of display during the model period, I would obtain my ROI. As explained earlier on, ROI can be used to compare the efficiency of different investment. Now, looking at the ROI formula itself, it's very important to highlight here that both the numerator and the denominator of that ratio should be expressed in terms of values. Let's take the following example. We are modeling volume sales as opposed to value sales, and we are using variables like promotions, investment in media, seasonality, and distribution to explain the variations in the volume sales. Now, remember, to compute the contribution of, for example, investment in media, will be multiplying the coefficient as estimated by my equation by the level of activity in media. And that will help me compute the incremental contribution. But because my sales are expressed in terms of volume, I will be having the incremental contribution in terms of volume. Remember, we said in the ROI is fundamental that your numerator and denominator are expressed in terms of value. So I need to express that incremental volume in terms of value. How can I do it? One solution would be to multiply that volume incremental by the price of your product. In that case, you would be obtaining value incremental, and that would be the component that would feature in the numerator of your ROI. On the other hand, imagine that your media investment consists in display, and to model display, you have used impressions. Impressions is not cost. It's not expressed in value. So it's very important that for your denominator, you will be translating your impressions in terms of spend. And that's why, for example, what you could do is multiply your number of impressions or the level of your activity expressed in impressions by the average cost of an impression. In that context, you will be obtaining the total cost of your display activity, and dividing your revenue incremental by the cost of the activity will give you the ROI. So this is an example where both your numerator and denominator were not expressed in terms of like value, and we had to translate them into value before we can compute the ROI. Once we do that, we can easily compare different ROI across different channels. ROI and contribution. In this slide, I would like to explain one of the key concepts of marketing mix modeling, which is actually the relationship between ROI and contribution. As your contribution increases, and because of diminishing returns, the more you spend on a channel, the less and less marginal contribution you obtain. That translates in a decreasing ROI. So as you decrease your spend, your contribution increases, but with diminishing returns. and that, as a consequence, will have a decrease in ROI. That's why the job of the modeler is to make sure that actually you achieve consistent and sustainable contribution while keeping an eye on the level of your ROI. In this slide, I would like to shed some light on the changes in the diminishing return curves. Now, we said earlier on that the relationship between ROI and spend is decreasing. So as I increase my spend, I expect my ROI to decrease. And as I decrease my spend, I expect my ROI to improve. But that is not always the case. Say, for example, you ran a project and you reported on your diminishing return curves. And then you had a refresh of data and you updated your model. It could be the case that you obtain a different diminishing return curve. And that could be explained by, for example, for a specific media channel, that there has been an improvement in the spot length mix, in the day part mix, in the laydown, or even the creative. In that context, my diminishing return curve will improve, so it will go up as compared to the initial project. On the other hand, your ROI curve will also be improving. So in certain contexts where you have execution level entities or details that have changed, that could translate into a better performance, better contribution, and that would improve your ROI. So in certain cases, when this happened, you could end up with an ROI that has improved even when the spend has increased. And that means that the campaign that you have run has been run much more effectively, much more efficient than before, and that made its ROI go up. Continuing on explaining the relationship between ROI and contribution, these slides are actually also an introduction to course 7 that deals with optimization. Optimization is based on the concept of the diminishing return curve. The diminishing return curve depicts the following story. The more you spend, the more you get, but at a slower and slower pace. If I have a budget of 200 that returns today 600K, it doesn't mean that when I double my budget to 400, I will obtain 1,200. In this context, I will be only obtaining 840. And these are the laws of diminishing returns. ROI, or considering ROI alone, could be misleading when it comes to deciding on the best course of actions when it comes to investment in media. In the example you have here, we can clearly see that the ROI of TV is higher than search. One could think that it makes sense to invest more money on television as opposed to search because actually the ROI of television is better than search. But this is not true. Let's do the following. Let's take 50K from the TV budget and invest those same 50K into the search budget. Now what happens is the following. Because I increased search budget by 50K, the search contribution will increase by 50K. But remember, we have decreased our TV budget by 50K, and that will translate in a loss of sales of 25K. But overall, I managed to increase my incremental revenue because I lost 25 on television, but I gained 50 on search. So the net revenue gain is actually 50 minus 25, which is 25K. The budget did not change because I just took 50K from television and put it on search. Now, all what I have done is that I have moved budget from a channel and I put it on another channel, and that translated in an improvement in my performance. Remember, TV had a bigger ROI than search, but that did not mean that I had to move budget to television. On the contrary, what I have done here is I took budget out of television and I invested it in search. The reason for which this happened is actually, if you look at the diminishing return curves for your search and TV, your TV is actually hitting diminishing returns. However, search is not hitting yet diminishing return curves, which means that if you take money from a channel that is heavily saturated and you put it in a channel that is not yet saturated, that's where you can gain incremental sales. So ROI alone cannot explain why you should be investing budget across channels, you should also look at your diminishing return curves. And that's why those diminishing return curves are really important to derive from your modeling in an accurate way, and those would be the basis of your optimization decisions. And that's what we'll be discovering even in more details in course number 7. In today's course, we covered the concept of ROI, contribution, and the relationship between the two. Contribution is actually the impact of a specific variable on your model. You can obtain aggregated contribution by summing up the impact of variables of the same nature. For example, you take your display activity contribution, you sum it up with your search activity contribution to form the contribution of your online group, and that would be called the aggregated contribution. Now, if you take the reference point, which is a parameter that you can define from the total contribution, you obtain what you call the adjusted contribution. And actually, there are 4 reference points that one could choose from, like the maximum, the minimum, 0, which is removing nothing, and the initial point. We have also defined the concept of ROI, being the revenue incremental as you take it from the model, divided by the cost of the activity. We have also highlighted the importance of the fact that both the numerator and the denominator should be expressed in terms of value as opposed to volume or impression or clicks or GRP or have you. And the last point that I ended up my presentation with is actually the importance of considering diminishing return curves when it comes to placing your investment. And I also talked about the trade-off between contribution and ROI. As your contribution increases, and because of diminishing returns, your ROI will decrease. So whenever you think about optimizing your budget, ROI alone couldn't be the indicator on where you should be spending your budget. You should also consider the saturation level of your media investments. Thank you very much for attending this course about ROI and contribution. In the next course, we'll be covering advanced modeling techniques, namely pool regression, nested modeling, and log linear. See you in the next course.